So good afternoon. Happy President's Day. There were 9 presidents before George Washington. I don't know if you know that or not, but he was not the first president of the United States. We're going back to 1919. None of you here were born in 1919, but your parents probably were, correct? And you know, your father and your mother. And they lived through one of the worst years of the 20th century. 1919 was just absolutely horrible from all aspects, including the Red Summer and rioting, our anarchist bombings, the Palmer raids. They are looking for the anarchists wherever they could find them. The Treaty of Versailles, and if you know this, Viva Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, they're applauding him in Paris. Wilson's a hero in Europe. In the United States, he's kind of a villain. And also, he gets sick. The Spanish flu, and we've gone through COVID the last bunch of years. I had 2 great uncles who died in 1920, I think, 1919, 1920, because of the Spanish flu, which may have started in Kansas, of all places. The American public was not told about Woodrow Wilson and his health issues. Prohibition. Who's in favor of being wet, able to drink? And who's in favor of pull all the booze, get rid of the booze? And that's what's going on in 1919. Shall the mothers and children be sacrificed to the financial greed of the liquor trade? It's up to you, voter, to decide. Vote dry. Vote for wet, for my sake. Vote for dry, for mine. And also, women get into position, not all women, certain number of women in the United States get into position where they can vote in federal elections. Hitler emerges in 1919 with this letter. This is the Gremlich letter. And it's the first actual piece of evidence of him and his anti-Semitism and how the Jews are a problem in Europe, and that surfaces in 1919. Have you heard about when molasses filled the streets of Boston? No. It sounds laughable, but it really was not a laughing matter. People were killed when molasses was all over the streets of Boston. It's a new world, and there's in the dictionary a new word. The word is called bagel. Bagel enters the dictionary in 1919. See, you learn something every day, don't you? How many of you like bagels? Anyway, so bagel power. We had bagel power. And Felix the Cat makes its debut. Felix the Cat. How many of you remember Felix the Cat? It made its debut, an animated debut in films in 1919. Doesn't look like much, but Felix was a huge, huge, huge star. In fact, Felix was the first big-time cartoon star. And United Artists Forum, the movie company, and there's Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffith and Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. All those names familiar to you? Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, W.D. Griffin, and Charles Chaplin? Because if I was talking to a bunch of 18-year-olds, they would say, who? Who? Now, they might know Chaplin, actually. And George Gershwin emerges, and he's got a song, and the song is called Swanee, and words by Irving Caesar, who I happened to meet in the late 1970s. He was an old guy by then. Music by George Gershwin, staged by Ned Wayburn at the Capitol Theater in New York. That is the first time George Gershwin's work is accepted by the American public. And there are 2 national parks. This national park is up in Maine, and that's Bar Harbor up in Maine. So there are 2 national parks that come to be that year. And you could dial. You could get your own phone. Excuse me. And no longer have an operator patch through your call. That is a 1919 phone. And we take that for granted today, right? Because we got these today, but that's what technology was 105 years ago. And the toaster came out. The toaster, it changed people's lives. You can now have eggs and toast, but you have to cut up the bread because there was no bread slicer. The bread slicer would come 9 years later. Remember the old saying, the greatest thing since sliced bread? Sliced bread came about 1920. How would you, I guess you would take just a knife and then cut it up and pop it into the toaster oven, wait a few minutes, and voila, you have toast. The war is over there. The war is over. It's 1919. World War I ended on November 11th, 1918, and most Americans were eager for peace and security, but the new year would prove to be exceptionally brutal. Perhaps the worst year of the 20th century, and now everybody here lived through 1968. 1968 looks like a peace parade compared to what happened in 1919. Revolution and unrest ran rapid across Europe and North America. The Spanish flu pandemic continued from the prior year with a third terrible wave in the spring. Terrorist bombings rocked 7 cities in June in the United States, first of the series of Red Scares. Now most of you lived through the Red Scares in the 1950s. That was the second Red Scare. This is the first Red Scare. And that began when the American government passed an act that blacklisted anyone thought to be involved with communism. Race riots, it was also called the Red Summer, rocked the nation. Hundreds of workers went on strike across the country, and 2 things would be changing. Constitutional amendments which would allow the women the right to vote, and also establishing prohibition. Those were significant developments in the 1919. Sorry about that. I should have basically said, shut off my phone. The Red Summer. This is the Red Summer. This is the Army protecting the streets of the United States. Ogden Cafe has reopened. American servicemen returned from the First World War only to find a new type of violent conflict waiting for them at home. An outbreak of racial violence known as the Red Summer. Anybody here know of the Red Summer? They never taught it to you in school. It was never taught in school. Like Tulsa, 1921, the riots in Tulsa, never taught in school. Basically, it was just, it happened, but it happened. So it's Red Summer, and 26 cities around the United States see rioting. The first race riot of what became known as Red Summer occurred in Charleston, South Carolina. Racial tensions across the United States were exasperated by the discharge of millions of military personnel back to their homes, domestic lives following the end of the war. Competition for opportunities in post-war America, combined with a racially charged social landscape, placed white and blacks in conflict with one another. The Red Summer. This is an aftermath after some rioting. World War I intensified the Great Migration, which was African Americans, Negroes in those days, from the rural South into the industrial North. They also brought with them into Chicago jazz. Louis Armstrong would end up in Chicago. And the Midwest in hopes of escaping poverty and discrimination of Jim Crow laws. Approximately 500,000 Americans by summer resettled in northern cities. In many cases, northern whites, many of them newly arriving immigrants, did not welcome their new black neighbors. When the war ended, returning servicemen resented their vacated jobs had been taken during the war by African Americans who worked cheap and weren't needed for the war, apparently. Black laborers already suffered from a negative reputation in white working community for their use as low-wage earning strikebreakers or scabs who would keep factories open while employees went on strike. That's the Harlem Hellfighters. They actually served during World War I. How you going to keep them down on the farms? That song sound familiar? How you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? It's a fair question for a country to ask. That was not easily going to return to the pre-war attitudes about race and citizenship. The return of the Doughboys brought an exuberant close to the war effort on November 11, 1918, but the tensions were boiling over because they felt that they were entitled to a piece of democracy and a piece of determination. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson kept repeating those terms as the President of the United States. Throughout the year, there was a way in which Americans seemed to hold two opposing views at the same time. Large number of African Americans chose their own form of self-determination, moving out of the South to the northern cities, the Midwest, and the West Coast. The Great Migration. The situation was made worse in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution of 1917. Many officials and others with little or no evidence said the black workers, they're being used by the Bolsheviks in the United States, in the anarchists, except there was no proof. Somebody just said something. And of course, in my business, as journalists, we're supposed to ask, well, give the proof. But unfortunately, one of the major failings in my business, and I know because I was too rough on people, according to others, no, you don't ask. You just let them talk and don't question. The newspapers and Wilson's federal government linked the black movements to Bolshevism. Armed resistance movements started as a response to the riots. Riot sweep Chicago. That is August 2nd, 1919. List of slain in 4 days rioting. Gun battles and fighting in the streets keep the city in an uproar. 4,000 troops in the armory, ready to patrol cities. Scores are killed. Ghastly deeds of race rioters told. Defendant reporter faces death in an attempt to get facts from mob violence. Hospitals are filled with maimed men and women. This is what's going on. The Red Summer was rooted in tensions and prejudice that arose from white people having to adjust to the demographic changes in their local communities. The bloodiest incident was in Arkansas, Elaine, Arkansas. And it was in the news recently, Elaine, Arkansas, about this. And I'll get to that a little later on. It's estimated that over 100 African Americans were killed. Racial eruption, and there was a racial eruption in many other southern locations as well as in the north, most notably in Chicago. The Seattle General Strike. There was a general strike in Seattle, and that's me in Seattle in November. The Seattle General Strike lasted 6 days, from February 6th to February 11th. For 2 days, the streets were entirely still. 60,000 workers from 100 different unions stayed home in solidarity with striking ship workers. By the third day, people were returning to work, and a fierce anti-union backlash, fueled by fears of a Bolshevik-style revolution, ensured the strike's end would be soon. The prevailing opinion was that Bolshevism had been beaten, law had triumphed. That is the only general strike in the history of the United States, in Seattle. The Red Scare, the race riots. It was a miserable summer. Couple that with the Spanish flu. This guy, Luigi Galliani, is the head of the anarchist movement. In 7 cities, all on the evening of June 2nd, all within 90 minutes of each other, bombs rocked New York City, Boston, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Paterson, New Jersey. Remember, that was the silk capital of the world, Paterson, New Jersey, in those days. The bombings were a concerted effort among U.S.-based anarchists who most likely were the disciples of Luigi Galliani, a vehemently radical anarchist who advocated violence to effect change to rid the world of laws and capitalism. Earlier, about a month earlier, in late April, radicals had also mailed over 30 booby-trapped dynamite-filled bombs to prominent politicians and appointees, including the Attorney General of the United States, Palmer, as well as justice officials, newspaper editors, businessmen such as John D. Rockefeller and the mayor of Seattle. Have you ever heard of this?
Yes.
Who's heard of this? You're the only one.
I am.
You're it. That's it.
I heard of it in Cleveland because of a couple of people
Oh,
I knew who
yeah.
were under threat.
Oh, okay. This is the anarchist bombing in New York City, in Manhattan. Among all the bombs addressed to the high-level officials, one bomb notably addressed to the home of a Federal Bureau of Investigation field agent once tasked with investigating the anarchists. Raymond Weston Fitch, who in 1918 arrested two prominent anarchists while leading a police raid on offices of their publication, Kronika Sovietici. Though no one was killed in these bombings, one senator's maid lost her hands. New York Times, this is January in 1919. Reds raided in scores of cities, 2,600 arrests, 700 in New York. Deportation hearings begin today. The Palmer raids, that was the Attorney General, Palmer, were a series of violent and abusive law enforcement raids directed at leftist radicals and anarchists beginning during a period of unrest known as Red Summer. Named after the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer with assistance from J. Edgar Hoover, the raids and subsequent deportations proved disastrous and sparked a vigorous debate about constitutional rights. Following the Russian Revolution in 1917, America was on high alert, fearing communist revolutionaries were sitting in America. The Sedition Act of 1918 was an expansion of the 1917 Espionage Act because of paranoia. Woodrow Wilson trampled all over people's rights. The industrial workers of the world are freed. These are guys who basically were workers and joined unions, and some of them were socialists. Targeting those who criticized the government, the Sedition Act set into motion an effort to monitor radicals, especially labor union leaders, with the threat of deportation looming over them. Anyone who is a member of the Industrial Workers of the World Union was particularly at risk. Special Division of the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI, charged with collecting information on leftist radicals, was created by Palmer in response to the bombs. J. Edgar Hoover, a Justice Department lawyer at the time, was put in charge of the group. Hoover coordinated intelligence from various sources to identify those radicals who he thought were the most violent. A woman by the name of Emma Goldman. Ever hear of Emma Goldman?
Yes.
Who said yes? Well,
I don't remember much about
Yeah.
it, but I know the name.
you know the name. Emma Goldman. Hoover's analysis led to raids and mass arrests under the Sedition Act in the fall of 1919 with well-known anarchist figures, Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, arrested. Police raided a location like the Russians' People House in New York City, where Russian immigrants often gathered for educational purposes. Department of Justice agents stormed the meeting room, beat the 200 occupants with clubs and blackjacks. In an algebra class that was interrupted by armed agents, the students watched a teacher being beaten. The detainees were ordered to hand over the money to agents who were then directed to, or then would tear the place apart. Dragged and shoved into patrol cars, taken into custody, agents searched among the detainees for members of the Union of Russian Workers. They found 39, and none of them had anything to do with the union. Raids across the United States continued, with police pulling suspects out of their apartments, often without arrest warrants. 1,000 people were arrested in 11 cities. 75% of the arrestees were released. The Spanish flu. Does this look familiar from like 4 years ago? It looks real familiar. I got one of these in my pocket right now, actually. I got two of them, see? Two masks. This is what it was like in 1919. And there were parallels between 1918, 19, and 20 with 2020 and 2021. The masks. The Spanish flu pandemic was the deadliest pandemic in world history, infecting some 500 million people across the globe, including my two great uncles who died. Although the family said they were poisoned by lovers, because that sounded better. They died of the Spanish flu. Roughly 1/3 of the population, causing up to 50 million deaths, including 675,000 deaths in the United States alone. The disease was caused by a new variant of the influenza virus and was spread in part by troop movements during World War I. No vaccines, no effective treatments. The pandemic caused massive social disruption. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Schools, theaters, churches, and businesses forced to close. Does that sound familiar?
I've heard it before.
You heard that before. Citizens ordered to wear masks. You ever hear that before? And bodies piled up in makeshift morgues in the streets. Did you hear that? Yeah. Kind of parallel situation. A third wave of the illness occurred during the winter and spring, adding to the pandemic death toll. The third wave of the pandemic subsided during the summer, but it was not over. Oh, check this out. You think this is new? Anti-mask meeting tonight, January 25th, Dreamland Rink, to protest against unhealthy mask ordinance. Extracts will be read from State Board of Health bulletin showing compulsory mask wearing to be a failure. And some guy by the name of Eugene E. Schmidt and other interesting speakers are there. The admission is free. Nobody knew about their expertise, but they knew that you shouldn't be wearing masks. People clamored to return to their normal lives. Businesses pressed officials. Reopen us. Does that sound familiar? Believing the pandemic was over, state and local authorities began rescinding public health edicts. Does that sound familiar? Taking their cues from officials who declared an end to the pandemic, Americans overwhelmingly returned to their pre-pandemic routines. They packed movie theaters, dance halls, crowded in stores and shops, gathered with friends and family. Well, that didn't exactly work because a third wave of the flu developed and people didn't listen to the experts. The 1919 Stanley Cup final round in hockey ended as one player, Joe Hall, died of pneumonia caused by the flu. Woodrow Wilson, president dangerously ill. Woodrow Wilson suffered an incapacitating stroke in October of 1919, President's Day, right? Which meant that his wife became the de facto president of the United States, Edith Wilson. Did you know that?
No.
Yeah,
You heard about that?
I read that.
Yeah, you read that. One. Do you want to know more? Do you want to know more about Edith Wilson? She was the de facto president of the United States.
There were 3 presidents that had that situation. I
Yeah.
heard.
Yeah, well, this one is probably the most famous. Woodrow Wilson wanted the perfect ending for him for World War I. Wilson hoped to sell the nation on his idea of participating in the League of Nations, but he was facing fierce opposition both in the Senate and in the court of public opinion. Henry Cabot Lodge was the Massachusetts senator, and he couldn't stand Woodrow Wilson. He was his nemesis in the battle for the League of Nations. Lodge was a staunch advocate of entering World War I on the side of the Allied powers. He was a consistent critic of Wilson because he felt that Wilson did not prepare the country for war. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, Lodge continued to attack Wilson, accusing him of being a weak leader and a hopeless idealist. In a speech before Congress, some of you might remember from high school history, the 18 points. On January 18th, 1918, Wilson goes before Congress. It was 14 points. I'm sorry, didn't mean 18. 14 points. 14 points, an ambitious blueprint for ending World War I that emphasized national self-determination for both small and large nations, and included the creation of a cooperative League of Nations to peacefully resolve all future disputes. Lodge criticized Wilson's 14-point plan. I did too. I think it was in 10th grade, and my teacher said, "Why are you criticizing that?" I said, "Because it didn't make sense to me as a 14-year-old. And that was in 1970. That was 51 years later, 52 years later. Lodge criticized Wilson's 14-point plan and contended that Germany needed to be militarily and economically crushed so it could never again be a threat to the stability of Europe. Was Lodge right?
No.
This is the text of the 14 points that Wilson came up with on January 8th, 1918. The 14 points: open diplomacy without secret treaties, economic free trade on the seas during war and peace, equal trade conditions, decrease armaments among all nations, adjust colonial claims, evacuation of all Central Powers from Russia and allow it to define its own independence, Belgium to be evacuated and restored, the return of the Alsace-Lorraine region and all French territories, readjust Italian borders, Austria-Hungary to be provided an opportunity for self-determination, redraw the borders of the Balkan region, creating Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, creation of a Turkish state with guaranteed free trade in the Dardanelles, creation of an independent Polish state, creation of the League of Nations. Well, that was ambitious, very ambitious. It wasn't going to work. But he goes over to Europe. Paris gives Wilson welcome of unexampled warmth. He declares for exemplary punishment of war makers, sees enduring peace only in the League of Nations. For the better part of 6 months between December 1919 and June, Wilson was in Europe negotiating the Treaty of Versailles and planning to help build the League of Nations. The treaty was signed on June 28th. Back home, the ratification of the treaty met with mixed public support and strong opposition from Republican senators led by Lodge as well as Irish Catholic Democrats. Why them? They're upset with England's, basically how England treated the Irish Catholics in Ireland. So that was a sticking point. Treaty of Peace, signed at Versailles, June 28, 1919. Henry Cabot Lodge opposed the Treaty of Versailles because the treaty stated that the U.S. would go to the aid of any member country without requiring congressional approval. He said, no, you cannot send troops without us saying yes, the Congressional House and Senate. And he said, you just can't do it. You can't send them into combat. You can't send them as a peacekeeping mission. You just can't do it. We need to say, okay, you can't do it. On September 3rd, Woodrow Wilson decides, well, I'm not going to listen to Lodge. I'm going directly to the people. I am going to take this train trip around the country and I am going to sell the League of Nations. And he starts out, and for 3.5 weeks, the president hits the rails. Also on the presidential train was the president's personal physician, Dr. Carrie T. Grayson, who did not want Wilson, who was a frail individual to start with, he did not want Wilson out on the rails. And Wilson's message: I can predict with absolute certainty that within another generation there will be another world war if the nations of the world do not concert the method to prevent it. Woodrow Wilson, Omaha, Nebraska, September 8th, 1919. Was he right? Okay, but his health is declining. Wilson wanted to promote American membership in the League of Nations, an international body that he hoped would solve international conflicts and prevent another bloody war like the one from which America just emerged, World War I. The tour would take an enormous toll on Woodrow Wilson's health. During September, as the presidential train traveled across the Midwest, into the Great Plains states, over the Rockies, into the Pacific Northwest, down the West Coast, turning back east, the president became thinner, paler, and even more frail. And he lost his appetite, his asthma got worse, and he complained of unrelenting headaches. He is in Utah. This is almost the end of the tour, not because he wanted to end it, but his health gets in the way. On the evening of September 25th, after speaking in Pueblo, Colorado, Edith Wilson discovered Woodrow in a profound state of illness. His facial muscles were twitching uncontrollably. He was experiencing extreme nausea. Earlier in the day, he complained of splitting headaches. On September 26th, the president's private secretary, Joseph Tumulty, announced that the rest of the speaking tour had been canceled because the president was suffering from a nervous reaction in his digestive organs. That was not the case. The tour's intense schedule, 8,000 miles, 22 days, cost Wilson his health. He suffered constant headaches during the tour, finally collapsing from exhaustion in Pueblo, Colorado. He does manage to return to Washington, and then he suffers a near-fatal stroke. That is Edith Wilson, and she's about ready to become the de facto president of the United States. And there's Woodrow. Take a look at him. Does he look like a healthy guy here?
Oh my God, his skin and bones.
Yeah, he's not in good shape. On October 2nd, according to some accounts, the president awoke to find his left hand numb to sensation before falling into unconsciousness. Other versions, Wilson had a stroke on the way back to the bathroom, fell on the floor with Edith dragging him back into bed. No matter what happened, Edith calls Ike Hoover, who is the aide, and says, "Please get Dr. Grayson. The president is very sick." Dr. Grayson arrives. 10 minutes later, he emerged from the presidential bedroom, and the doctor's diagnosis was terrible. "My God, the president is paralyzed." Woodrow Wilson, Dr. Grayson. The country does not have a functioning president. And the vice president is kept away by Edith Wilson. In fact, everybody's kept away. She was the gatekeeper, and from here to the end of Wilson's term, March of 1921, Edith Wilson is, in fact, the de facto president of the United States. The public was never told of Wilson's stroke. Cover-up began, led by Dr. Grayson and Edith Wilson. They thought it would be best if Woodrow was not informed of just how serious his condition was. When Dr. Grayson briefed the cabinet, the question of secession came up, but he refused to sign any official notice of disability. He also discouraged letting the public know of the extent of the president's condition. He was bedridden. He couldn't move. He was an invalid. And the public never knew. Never knew. And there she is, Edith Wilson, de facto President Edith Wilson. Edith Wilson blamed Republican opponents in Congress for her husband's stroke, as their vehement opposition to the League of Nations often took form in character assassination. Edith was more suspicious of the political motives of Vice President Thomas Marshall. She thought he was going to stab Woodrow Wilson in the back. Well, she closely guarded access to her husband. She kept the true extent of Wilson's incapacitation from the press and his opponents. While Wilson laid in bed, unable to speak or move, Edith purportedly insisted she screen all of Wilson's paperwork. In some cases, signing Wilson's name to the documents without consulting her invalid president. She said, listen, it isn't what you think. It isn't what you think. I was just acting as a steward and helping him out. Except he couldn't function, and she was making decisions. The Senate defeats the Treaty of Versailles 49-35, orders it returned to the president. German disorders grow, hundreds slain. That's the New York Times after the Senate says no to Wilson. On November 19th, the Senate spurred the Treaty of Versailles that had ended World War I, provided for a new world body championed by Wilson, the League of Nations. It was the first time the Senate would say no to the League of Nations, but it would not be the last time. Wilson, for his efforts, got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919 for his role as founder of the League of Nations. Didn't matter to people in the United States, Wilson's baby, the League of Nations, failed to gain support in America, and also Wilson probably didn't even know he won the Nobel Peace Prize because he was an invalid. It's over. It's over there. And, you know, the Yanks are coming, right? The Yanks are coming, and it isn't going to be over until it's over there. But now it's over there. The Versailles Treaty carved up Europe. France wanted to make sure Germany was so severely punished that a German surrender was not enough. German soldiers, like the wounded Adolf Hitler, were infuriated with the settlement. This is the Gremlich Letter. Nobody here familiar with the Gremlich Letter? It's written in 1919, and it is the first evidence of Hitler's problems with Jews and also the Treaty of Versailles. Adolf Gremlich contacted Hitler asking him about the importance of the Jewish question. At the time, Hitler had recently undergone a course in pan-German nationalism in which he distinguished himself by the vehemence of his radical nationalism and anti-Semitic views and his skills as a guy who could give speeches. It's kind of funny because he wasn't a German citizen. He was an Austrian citizen. He would not renounce his Austrian citizenship until 1925. He was an Austrian. On September 16th, Hitler responded with a letter now called the Gremlich Letter. In response to Gremlich, Hitler appears anxious to establish his credentials as a knowledgeable anti-Semite through his rhetoric, and even though it's quite tame, stressing the need for a rational and scientific anti-Semitism. He calls for the irrevocable removal of Jews from German life, but it is clear from the context at this point, Hitler only meant segregation or expulsion rather than systematic liquidation. And he's also from Austria. Prohibition. It's Carrie Nation. She carried a hatchet. She went in the saloons and she decided she was going to bust up bottles. Carrie Nation. On January 16th, the 18th Amendment was ratified, placing alcohol prohibition in the United States Constitution. The country was scheduled to go dry at midnight, January 17th, 1920. In 1826, the first temperance society is formed, the American Temperance Society. While it had some success, it wasn't until the proliferation of saloons after the Civil War that the temperance movement gained some traction. There's a whole bunch of women, and they're upset. They're very, very upset with the boys inside drinking and then coming home and beating them up. And this is a problem. This is a major, major problem. And this is a cartoon from February 21st, 1874. In 1873, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded. The temperance movement got its most forceful voice. The histories of the temperance movement and the women's movement are often linked, which is why the WCTU originally proposed the ban of alcohol as a method for preventing abuse from their alcoholic husbands. The WCTU spent many years building the movement through education and state laws, and by 1881 it had a big success in Kansas when in the state constitution there was a ban of alcohol. There she is, Carrie Nation. The best part about Carrie Nation now, there is a bar almost adjacent to the State House in Boston, Massachusetts. And it was Boston's original speakeasy. And you know what the name of the bar is today? Carrie Nation. Anyway, there she is with her axe. At this time, the Carrie Nation came into prominence by attacking saloons with a hatchet. Those saloons still maintain their popularity. That popularity was on decline during the Progressive Era, which started in 1890 when the hostility towards saloons became widespread. The push for prohibition gained momentum, often with women and Protestant congregations leading the way. During World War I, there was a temporary prohibition on alcohol production. There was also a pronounced anti-German sentiment pushed by the Anti-Saloon League. And since many brewers were German and often the loudest opponents of prohibition, this temporary situation dealt a serious blow to the anti-prohibition forces. But support for the ban on alcohol grew. Close the saloons. If you believe that the traffic in alcohol does more harm than good, help stop it. Strengthen America campaign, 165 East 22nd Street, Manhattan. On December 18th, 1917, constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol was proposed in the Senate. And in October, Congress passed the Volstead Act, National Prohibition Act, which was enabling legislation that set down rules for enforcing the ban on alcohol and defined the types of alcoholic beverages to be prohibited. The proposed ban went out for a vote across the 48 states. Vote dry, vote dry, vote dry, as you can see in this march against alcohol. The Prohibition movement wanted to rid American society of the tyranny of the drink. Do you think that drinking was tyranny? The act of drinking would not be illegal, nor would it be illegal to make wine at home. Farmers that grew fruit maintained their ability to produce hard cider, and whiskey and wine would be available for medicinal and religious purposes. Women's suffrage, the official program, Women's Suffrage Procession, Washington, D.C., March 3rd, 1913, the eve of Woodrow Wilson being inaugurated as president. On the eve of Wilson's inauguration, protesters staged a massive suffrage parade in the nation's capital. Hundreds of women were injured in confrontations with police. That same year, Alice Paul went on a hunger strike, and she was arrested for being on a hunger strike. The strike was to get women's votes. They put her into a sanitarium because they thought she was crazy. Alice Paul. She was still around in 1972 when the Equal Rights Amendment was passed by Congress, but never became a law because it failed to get the 38 states needed for it to become a law. Alice Paul was the founder of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which later became the National Women's Party. And there is a young Alice Paul. The organization staged numerous demonstrations and regularly picketed the White House, among other militant tactics. As a result of these actions, some group members were arrested and served jail time. Things would change in 1918 with this woman, Carrie Chapman Catt, who is a bit older than Alice Paul and wasn't as radical as Alice Paul. In 1918, Wilson switched his stand on women voting rights from objection to support through the influence of Carrie Chapman Catt, who is now the leader of the movement. Wilson also tied the proposed suffragette amendment to America's involvement in World War I and the increased role women played while the men were away over there. When the amendment came up for a vote, Wilson addressed the Senate in favor of suffrage. As reported in the New York Times on October 1st, 1918, Wilson said, "I regard the extension of suffrage to women as vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged." This is it. Joint resolution, the 19th Amendment, for the vote. On June 4th, the U.S. Congress approved the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which would guarantee suffrage to women, and sent it to the U.S. for ratification. Except it wasn't all women. Didn't really apply to African American women. They faced poll taxes and stuff. Didn't apply to Asian American women and others, Native Americans. One of the things about Native American women, they lived on reservations. They weren't part of any state. And so it would take a long time for all women. Asian Americans took till 1952 to get the right to vote. Oh, this is molasses all over the place. This may sound funny, that Boston was stopped because molasses was all over the place. But it's kind of sad. January 15th, 2 million gallons of molasses flooded Boston, Massachusetts in the Great Molasses Flood when a storage tank burst, drowning 21 people in molasses and injuring 150. It sounds like Batman and Robin being dumped in molasses. Storage tank on Commerce Street containing 2.5 million gallons of molasses ruptured just after noon, spilling the vicious brown syrup through the streets of the neighborhood. That is the North End, that's the Italian end of town. And it was going at about 35 miles an hour. Can you imagine looking up and seeing molasses coming at you at the speed of 35 miles an hour? That's what was going on. People, horses, vehicles, houses swept up in the flood. The tank was built in 1915. It was unsound, and the rivets gave away. Here's Henry Ford, the Dearborn Independent. Henry Ford, 1919. The Jew is a race that has no civilization to point to, no aspiring religion, no great achievement in any realm. Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent. He buys that newspaper in 1919 and starts to spread the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And not only does he sell it in Dearborn, but it's in all Ford dealerships across the country. He served as a forum for Ford's views, free from other media outlets that attacked his work and values and were outside of his control. The Dearborn Independent covered world events, business and economic news, and fiction from noted authors. It served as an outlet for Ford's anti-Semitic sentiments. He republished the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a forgery, but he had a great fan in Germany, a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler, who was Henry Ford was Hitler's inspiration. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a notorious forgery that originally came from Russia, translated into English. It claimed the existence of an international Jewish conspiracy. A group of Jews got together and ran the world. The Dearborn Independent was available in the Ford dealerships. You may remember Felix the Cat. I was not a big Felix the Cat person. The cartoons that I watched as kids were really stupid. No, that was Crazy Cat. The mouse threw a brick at Crazy Cat, and you got in love. I mixed up Crazy Cat with Felix the Cat, but both of them were not for me. But this cat was a huge, huge star. Although there were earlier cats animated by the Pat Sullivan Studios, it is generally agreed that Feline Funnies, released on November 9th, is the first appearance of Felix the Cat. Felix's initial name was Master Tom, changed to Felix for The Adventures of Felix, which was released on December 14th. And the cat became the world's first animated superstar. Although Pat Sullivan is officially credited as the creator of Felix the Cat, it is agreed that Otto Menzmer was the actual creator. United Artists. So how many of you heard of Douglas Fairbanks Sr.? Oh yeah. Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, who was from Canada and never gave up her British-Canadian citizenship, even though she was America's sweetheart. D.W. Griffith, who put out Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan rebirth in 1915. And Charlie Chaplin. I'm sure everybody here has heard of Charlie Chaplin. They called themselves United Artists, but the trades called it a rebellion against established producing and distribution agreements. The Paramount Pictures founder, Adolph Zucker, reportedly said, "The inmates have taken over the asylum." Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, D.W. Griffith went before the cameras on February 5th to announce the creation of a corporation to distribute their own films. They claim it was necessary to protect their own interests as well as to protect the exhibitor and the industry from itself. The four were reacting to what they saw was a threat to limit their salaries and the quality of their films. They knew they were risking their careers by committing to put up their own money to produce their own films without hindrance from anyone, including each other, and distribute them through their own company. Swanee, How I Love You, How I Love You. It's amazing how two Jewish guys from New York, Irving Caesar and George Gershwin, came up with a song which basically glorifies the South, when neither one of them were ever there. Swanee, the Swanee River. Well, this guy, Al Jolson, decides to sing it. Now, he can't, now what Jolson used to do, he used to go to songwriters and said, listen, I'll make your song a hit, but you gotta put my name on the credits. I have to get money as a writer. And he did that, and others did that through the years too. Jolson just did he did it a lot. But he couldn't do it with this song, because he heard this song at a party, and it was playing on Broadway. Swanee is an American popular song written by George Gershwin, lyrics by Irving Caesar. The tune was written for a New York City revue called Demi-Tasse, which opened in October. The song had little impact in its first show, but Gershwin played it at a party and Al Jolson was there. And Jolson says, I love this song. I'm going to put it into the show that I'm in right now, Sinbad. Swanee put George Gershwin on the road to success. Oh, and there's a new dictionary word. Bagel. Bagel. My granddaughter, when years ago, when she was 2 years old, my granddaughter, I said, how do you spell bagel? And she said, N-O. She was about, at that time, 21 months old. She had figured it out. It's a plain bagel. Let me go around the room. How many of you like sesame? Sesame bagels. Oh yeah, blueberry, garlic, whole wheat, everything. Everything. Well, I don't have any because I didn't bring any bagels with me.
Oh, gee, that's terrible.
Yeah, so anyway, the bagel. The Oxford English Dictionary defined 309 words with first citations in 1919. Bagel, noun, a hard ring-shaped bread roll, was first mentioned in the dictionary spelled beagle, B-E-I-G-E-L. The dictionary also has an 1892 citation for buglich. The word is from the Yiddish bagel, ultimately the Old High German Bulgari. So now you know a bagel's been the thing now for 105 years. Oh, and the dial phone. How many of you still have a rotary phone? I still have a rotary phone. It just sits upstairs. I don't do anything with it, but I still have a rotary phone. Anyway, AT&T installed the first dial telephones in the Bell system in Norfolk, Virginia on November 8th. This was a dramatic change for customers. They went from lifting the receiver, operator please, asking the operator for assistance, to dialing the number themselves. And you know what? Bell Telephone put out pamphlets how to dial a telephone.
Oh my God.
Because people didn't know how to dial a telephone. They couldn't figure it out. You know, it's only, what was it, 7 numbers in those days. But, you know, they didn't know that you could spin the dial.
That was
So
up in New York, wasn't
Yeah.
it?
What?
Did that person up in New York State?
Norfolk, Virginia.
Where?
That's where it started, Norfolk, Virginia. That's where the first ones were. There you go. See, learn here how to use the new dial telephone service. And this is a woman explaining to this woman, you pick up the phone like that, you hear a dial tone, you put your finger in there, and all it does is it goes to where you stop. And then you go to the next number, and then the next number. That's how, see, it says learn how to use it. People couldn't figure it out. The Model 50AL, or the candlestick, was the first freestanding dial telephone. The dial tone, coupled with phones featuring rotary numbers, allowed callers to dial phone numbers themselves. How many of you still need a toaster? Yeah, you still need a toaster. Well, if you were around in 1919, you could buy a toaster, and your problems would be solved. Charles B. Straight designed a pop-up toaster because he wanted a decent breakfast at work. The cafeteria frequently burned toast because busy cooks neglected to turn off the toaster in time. Straight set out to solve this problem. This is a major problem, right? When your bread gets too brown, you know, and you got to scrape it off and all that other stuff. It's a major problem, isn't it? Anyway, his design featured heating elements that simultaneously toasted both sides of the bread, a timer that automatically turned off the heat, and springs that pushed up multiple pieces of perfectly brown toast. Problem solved, right? Problems absolutely solved for him and others. And the Grand Canyon, that's my kid's Grand Canyon, in 1994 becomes a national park. The Grand Canyon had a long and arduous road to becoming a national park, beginning in the 1880s with several failed congressional bills. After making multiple visits to the area, Theodore Roosevelt declared the Grand Canyon a national monument in 1908. The bill to grant national park status to the area was passed on February 26th, signed by Woodrow Wilson. Lafayette National Park at Mount Desert Island, Bahaba. Anybody been to Bahaba? Anybody?
What's that?
Bahaba. I'm trying to speak like somebody from Maine. Bahaba. Nice place, right? Really nice place. Is also designated a national park. The legacy from 1919. After the October 2nd stroke, Woodrow Wilson was a near invalid. The 25th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified almost 50 years later. On February 10th, 1967, and established and explained the complete order of presidential succession, as well as a series of contingency plans to fill any executive vacancies. Woodrow Wilson brings Birth of a Nation to the White House, which kicked off the second Ku Klux Klan. He also made sure that all African Americans were taken out of cabinet positions. He was a racist, to be kind. Remove Woodrow Wilson's name from New Brunswick Public School now. Wilson's legacy is at best mixed. He did lead the country through World War I. He was instrumental in crafting the League of Nations, but he took freedoms away during World War I. He was a racist. He possessed sympathy for the lost cause narrative. Wilson gave his newly appointed cabinet permission to segregate their departments. The KKK had a revival during his term. On June 27, 2020, the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs was changed to the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Wilson was the president of Princeton at one time. And the Wilson College will be renamed, or was renamed, First College. On January 26, 2022, Camden, New Jersey's Woodrow Wilson High School got a new name, Eastside High School. Wilson did appoint his close friend, Justice Louis Brandeis, to the Supreme Court, the first Jewish American to sit on the highest court. Wilson's agenda, which passed Congress at the end of 1913, included tariff, banking, labor reforms. He's the guy who introduced the income tax. How many of you are in favor of income tax?
Wait, what's his name?
Woodrow Wilson.
I like him.
You like him, why?
Wait, what did you say about the income tax?
He introduced it.
He introduced it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he introduced it. And expanded the executive branch with the creation of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Internal Revenue Service. He embraced and encouraged new technology. He started air mail service, and he's the guy who said, you know, we need an interstate highway system. Didn't happen during his tenure. It happened during Warren G. Harding's tenure. That's how you got Route 66. And how many have got your kicks on Route 66? I do. I've been in Flagstaff, Winona, Kingman, Barstow, San Bernardino. Yeah, I've been in 5 of those places. So anyway, and at the end in Santa Monica. Legacy, the ACLU started because of Woodrow Wilson and the Palmer raids. The final Palmer raid took place on January 2nd, 1920. The raids led to the formation of the American Civil Liberties Union. In its first year, the ACLU fought the campaign of harassment and deportation ordered by the U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. The ACLU defended Palmer's targets as well as politically radical immigrants, supported the rights of the international workers of the world, members, and other trade unionists to hold meetings and organize. The ACL, remember Orson Bean? Orson Bean, he was a humorist, he was on game shows. His father was one of the people who put together the ACLU. It also secured the release of hundreds of activists imprisoned for their anti-World War I views and activities. Oh, remember I told you about Alena, Arkansas, right? There was a memorial that was recently planted in Arkansas commemorating the summer of the Red Riots. But on August 21st, 2019, Living Memorial, a willow tree memorializing African American lives lost during a Red Summer massacre in Elaine, Arkansas, was chopped down in what some fear was an act of hate. The tree had been planted a few months earlier in April. The Red Summer has no national observances. History textbooks ignore it. Like I said, other than one woman here, none of you knew about this. None of them. Most museums don't acknowledge it. On November 29th, 2023, the city of Charleston, South Carolina, unveiled a historical marker dedicated to the Red Summer. These are the only two places that have any kind of memorials to the Red Summer. Oh, well, there goes the alcohol. Prohibition, and most women got the right to vote. They became constitutional amendments in 1920. Prohibition ended in 1933. Not all Americans got the, female Americans got the right to vote. 1920, Native Americans weren't allowed to be United States citizens. You know that?
Wow.
No. It wasn't until 1924 they became citizens. So federal amendment didn't give them the right to vote. With the passage of the Snyder Act in 1924, American-born Native women gained citizenship. But as late as 1962, individual states still prevented some women from voting by the use of literacy tests, poll taxes, claims of residence on reservations, meaning that one wasn't a resident of a state. Native-born Asian Americans had U.S. citizenship in 1920, but first-generation Asian Americans didn't. Asian American immigrant women were therefore excluded from voting until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 allowed them to gain citizenship more than 3 decades after the 19th Amendment. Literacy tests. By the way, poll tests were eradicated in 1964 by a constitutional amendment. Some African American suffragettes in the North could vote, but throughout much of the country, the same voter suppression tactics that kept black men from the polls kept black women from voting too. Literacy tests, poll tax, voter ID requirements, intimidations, and threats of violence were problems until the passage of the Voter Rights Act in 1965. Supreme Court overturned portions of the Voters' Rights Act in 2013. Numerous states, particularly in the South, were trying to make voting as difficult as possible. No Nazis are allowed in Germany these days. The Nazi Party has been outlawed. That's Reichstag, Germany. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in 1932. Hitler was a big fan of Henry Ford's anti-Semitic writing, mentioning the caretaker by name in his own 1925 anti-Jewish manifesto, Mein Kampf. In 1938, Germany awarded Ford the Gold Cross, Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the country's highest medal for foreigners. Germany annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938. Germany invaded Poland, September 1st, 1939, which started World War II. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The war ended in 1945. Ha ha ha! It's Felix the Cat. Well, Pat Sullivan began a comic strip starring Felix on August 19, 1923, distributed by King's Feature Syndicate. Several manufacturers made stuffed Felix toys. Jazz bands such as Paul, you've heard of Paul Whiteman?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Did you ever hear Paul Whiteman? Yeah. There you go. Played songs about him, such as the 1923's Felix Kept Walking. By the late 1920s, with the arrival of sound cartoons, Felix's success was fading. The new Disney shorts of Mickey Mouse made the silent offerings of Sullivan and Otto Messner, who were unwilling to move to sound production, seem outdated. When the two did sound Felix cartoons, it was a flop. Felix today remains part of the culture, and the character is controlled by Comcast, NBC, Universal. There are the United Artists people. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks got married in 1920. They produced a movie a year through the 1920s. Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffith spent more time trying to get money and advertisers and theater owners to get aboard. UA did release such hits as Chaplin's The Gold Rush, Fairbanks' Robin Hood, and Pickford, America's Sweetheart, the Canadian, in several titles, including Tess of Storm County. UA film titles over the years. Tell me if you've ever heard of any of these movies. The African Queen, High Noon,
Yeah.
Marty,
Yeah.
Witness for the Prosecution, Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, The Magnificent Seven, West Side Story, the James Bond and Pink Panther series, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Rocky. I think they did pretty well. What do you think? Yeah. They are now part of Amazon. They are owned by Amazon now. Oh, that's George Gershwin's piano. That is in the Smithsonian Institute. George Gershwin's piano. And this is the legacy of George and Ira Gershwin. The last song was Here to Stay, Our Love is Here to Stay. And this is basically talks about the 1920s, and that is the piano that George Gershwin composed upon. George Gershwin died in 1937 from a brain tumor. He had 18 years at the time. He was just 39. George Gershwin, along with his brother, the lyricist Ira Gershwin, continues to tower over the music industry. Porgy and Bess is now widely regarded as Gershwin's masterpiece. His influence on musicians is massive. His songs have not faded from the public ears. Love is Here to Stay. How many of you remember Love is Here to Stay? That was the last song he ever wrote. The last song. The tune was. Ira would put the words to it later. Ira Gershwin wrote the lyrics after George's death as a tribute to his brother. Originally titled It Is Here to Stay, and then Our Love is Here to Stay, the song was finally published as Love is Here to Stay. Ira wanted to change the title back to Our Love is Here to Stay, but he figured everybody knows it that way, so why bother? And that's 1919. Any questions, any comments about 1919?